Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. It is a pleasure to have Rabbi Leibtag with us. It is such an honor, and we appreciate you making the time. We wanted to, before we begin talking about the Gush Tanakh method, a topic that we've discussed a few times on the podcast, we'd like you to first introduce yourself, tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, so I want to begin with a question, okay? Because what you just asked me, I always ask my students, because Passover is coming up, Pesach. And I asked my students, pretend you were never at a Seder, but you read the Bible, and it was your job to tell the story of the Exodus to a group of people when you had 10 minutes. So where would you start the story, and where would you end the story? Again, pretend you were never at a Seder, and you ask your students to think for a minute. It's not easy for some of them. And to think for a minute, based on what you remember from your Bible study, from studying Tanakh or Chumash, or your Jewish education, how would you tell the story of the Exodus? Where would you begin, and where would you
Personally,
end?
I would begin with the story of Yosef, like getting sold into slavery, and that whole story.
Okay, and where would you begin?
To be fair, I would have just started with them already being in Egypt, and then I would have just started from the beginning of Shmot with Moshe's birth until.
Okay, so there's both legitimate opinions. I can start with the birth of Moshe. I can start with the birth of I think.
Well, you said I had 10 minutes. That's why I said that.
Yeah, okay.
If I have 10 minutes, I'm probably just going to start with Moshe's birth.
Okay. That's how. What's that movie called? Prince of Egypt.
Yeah,
right? It starts with baby Moses. I can start with the burning bush. I can start with the new Pharaoh. I can start with Yaakov with the wagons. I can start with Yosef and his brothers. Right.
Yep.
I could start, but I wouldn't start with Craig. But I was born in Akron, Ohio. That's where I was born. So your introduction depends on, now, where would you end the story of the Exodus?
it's a tough one.
You can end after
Entering the land.
Suf. You can end after Yam Suf. You can end Ma'amad Har Sinai.
Yeah, but then
If you have 10 minutes, again, I'm taking the 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll give you 15 minutes. Okay, 15 minutes.
If I had 15 minutes,
journeying in the desert and then ending up in the land, I think I would end there.
Okay, you can end up getting to land of Israel.
Yes.
You can end up at Har Sinai, and you can end up getting out of Egypt or splitting the sea.
Yeah.
That's the answers you always hear. Now, those three answers, I'd like to associate them with three different yarmulkes or kippot. So if your audience, if they're kippah sruga people, these kind of people, everything about the land of Israel, of course, the story ends with we get the land of Israel.
Uh-huh.
If you're, I would say black yarmulke, but more in the Haredi world, you answer Har Sinai because that's why we came out of Egypt, to get the Torah. That's the essence of Judaism. And if you're wearing no kippah, if you're a secular Jew or a what we call a secular Jew, you'd end with freedom splitting the sea. Now is it freedom from? Is it freedom for or freedom to? Now, all three answers are correct. There's a value in freedom in itself, because no one should be oppressed. But freedom for is more the biblical theme. There's a reason why God took you out of Egypt, was to become his people, to keep the Torah. But God doesn't want his people, he wants a nation keeping Torah. To be a nation, you need a land. So again, all three are correct, but it goes into freedom from, freedom for, freedom to. But when you ask that question, that's already teaching methodology, but the question is, when you read Torah, it's what message you're getting out of it. We'll discuss the methodology. You're going to ask me about Gush methodology.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I'm going to give you an example of it. I just have to tell you where I'm from.
Sure.
Now, where would you begin? That's more important.
Yeah, that's another thing. You begin at childbirth.
That's what I'm stuck with. So I was born in Akron, Ohio, but I'm not going to start there. And my father was a shul rabbi in a small little town. So I went to public school I lived with my father. That was a big advantage. I wasn't stuck in luckily I didn't go through the yeshiva system. Most people who have an impact, who are people who didn't go through the regular system, and people who didn't. and because they see it better from the outside. Anyway, then I went away to high school to Baltimore, and everyone else was going to Israel after 12th grade. I was starting a fad then back in the 70s. So I went to Israel for a year and got brainwashed. And then and I stayed. I went to Cal, I did Hes there, and then I went to Gush, and I got stuck there pretty much. But it wasn't really a planned career, it just happened by chance kind of thing. Amazing. So we'll get that in a minute. Now, just for the fun of it, I'll start with the Exodus. No one in their mind, no one would have started with Lavan. No one would have started with Terach, correct? No one, but that's what we do. But it's over the place, isn't it? We start with we were slaves in Egypt, and then we jump something about Terach, then we jump about Lavan. We never mentioned Moshe. We never mentioned Yosef and his brothers. Right. But our Seder is so complicated. But now, if you take a step back and study it, where it's coming from, I'm going to give you an example of Gush methodology. There's got to be logic to it. But the key in studying the Seder, there's always, I'll give you one more question, then we'll get to where I'm coming from. What word is going to be most found in Magid? What word are you going to see more than any other word? Just take a wild guess. If you're telling the story of the Exodus, what word do you think is going to come up a lot?
Avadim?
Yeah, if that makes a lot of sense. Maybe Egypt, something like that. So, but the answer
Egypt, okay. Oh, okay. Yes.
What's the answer? Shene Amar.
Right. You're always quoting. Yep.
Yeah, every other line, you're quoting a verse. Now, what's our custom? Shene Amar, you quote the verse, and you're in Pesukei Zimra mode. You just read the verse, and I guess must mean something. And my goal is to read the text, because this is ancient text. I have to read the Haggadah. But what Chazal wants you to do is look up that verse. There's a reason they're quoting it. There's a step behind it. And if I want to give an example of the Gush methodology, if Chazal are quoting a pasuk, they're assuming not just the pasuk, you read it, you know its context. Or I like to say, give Chumash as much respect as you give a newspaper. Because when you read a newspaper article, you're assuming not only the sentences make sense, but there's a flow from sentence to sentence.
An internal logic.
Yeah. It's called the davar dibur al fanav, or it's called pshuto shemikra. Now, that doesn't mean there's deeper messages, but the first thing you need to do is study the text. We call it objective analysis. Now, the question is, what's your underlying assumption when you study the text? What text you're reading? What's the purpose? Why was it written? So I'll give you like a quick example from creation. Did God tell us the story of creation to know that He created, to know how He created, to know why He created, or to understand why we're chosen? Now, when I'm reading Sefer Bereshit, I'm reading a history book, an authentic history of here's how creation happened. I'm getting the facts what it is, or am I getting a book that was written to explain to the Jewish people why they're chosen? It's two different approaches.
Yeah.
So if I'm assuming divine authorship, but that's of course our assumption. Again, how God transmits it, that's a technicality. You have certain assumptions you're making, but the most important belief is that there's a God. We know that He is, we know what He is, but there's a God, and we take that for granted. And He chose us to be His people. It only makes sense that if God's choosing a people, He would give us a book to understand why we're chosen. So when I read Sefer Bereshit, I'm reading a book that God gave us. My assumption is, I think Rashi goes that it was given to us in preparation for Har Sinai. The book was written for a nation that went through slavery. Just came out of Egypt, is on this roller coaster of history, going through these amazing events. It's been suffering as slavery, witnessing great miracles. They're about to become a nation. They need a book to understand where they're coming from, where they're going to, why they're chosen, how come there's 12 tribes, who this God is, what's our relationship with other nations. Now, when you read the book that way, how you read the book, how you interpret the book is very different than I'm reading a book of history or a book of theology or a book about how not to bring up a family. If you understand my joke. Yeah. If someone's looking for a book, how to bring up a family, don't give them a chumash. But if you would like to understand what's the meaning of chosenness and what's the meaning why God chose you, and why is there a Jewish people, then you read Sefer Bereshit. Now, I can learn family values from the book, but the book wasn't written to teach you, family values. I can learn it from it, but that's not the goal of the book. So that's if you want the approach, that's pretty much the approach that my main Rebbe is Rabbi Ben. I'm sure you've heard him quoted all the time. He's and then Rabbi Mordechai Breuer taught in Gush, Rabbi Yaakov Medan, Rabbi Amnon. But there's all the people they quote. There's like there's so many amazing teachers, but there is no one defined Gush methodology. There's no Gush approach because we argue with each other all day long, and that's the Jewish approach. We argue.
I love the videos where
Rabbi Dan and Rabbi
where they're
Bazak,
sitting down on like I don't know, it seems like a little like orchard or garden, or I don't know where they're sitting. And then I'll see like, Ravon Bazak and Ramadan, and they're like arguing with each other, but with the biggest smile on their faces.
Yeah.
It's just it's a very refreshing, beautiful thing. Uh,
So our Jewish tradition is to argue in search of understanding. There is no one. That's the beauty of the Torah.
No ego arguments.
It's open. It's open for. It's intentionally open. God wants us to argue, and it's through that argument. I'll give you one example, like the Akedah story. Does it have of course, it must have a message, but it's almost impossible. Did Abram do the right thing? Did the wrong thing? Was it possible? Was it a test you could possibly test? But the study of the story becomes a catalyst that creates a discussion of what happens when you have conflict between basic morality and divine command. Because you follow divine command, but you have to follow your conscience and your moral compass. What do you do when they conflict? That's a life challenge, isn't it? So the Akedah story sparks a discussion of how to deal with that conflict. And what the beauty of Chumash is that through that discussion of the conflict, that's how you build your understanding. How do you deal with the conflict? You argue about it, and you see the different sides of it. But the message of the Akedah story is our discussion of it, because it's taking two values, putting against each other. And it's not a question of do the right thing or the wrong thing. We're not sitting back and judging the biblical characters. That's not our goal. Our goal is, what do I learn from the story? Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Let God judge that. God's giving us stories to study, because it's through that study and discussion of who's the right thing and the wrong thing. I'll give you an example from you mentioned Rabbi Bazak and and Gush. She's one of my best friends. We schmooze all the time.
I absolutely love Rabbi Bazak. Yeah. Love him.
So there's the Tanakh Meyun in Gush every summer. So one year, by chance, he and Rav Samet, you've heard of Elchanan Samet also. He's like, as a pedagogue, both of them they're such good teachers. They're like, and their approach is solid.
Yep.
They're really good. They both taught the story of Shechem and Dinah with Dinah and Shimon and Levi.
Oh, I know this.
So what did we learn from this story? Now, there's a theory that maybe people's political understanding might affect how they interpret things, just by chance. What's both are anshe peshat, like Shuto Shemikra. Rav Samet reaches the conclusion that Shimon and Levi did the right thing because they get the last word in, and he does a beautiful analysis of the text and the story, proving that they're right. You follow? And more Yaakov the wrong. Rabbi Bazak does the same literary analysis, the point, and proves that they were wrong and what they did was a disaster because Yaakov got the last word in. Now, who's right? Now, I bring that as an example. God wanted there to be an argument between Rabbi Bazak and Rav Samet, because sometimes you need Shimon and Levi, and sometimes it's disaster for Shimon and Levi. It all depends on what are they arguing over. How necessary was it to wipe out the city of Shechem? How big was the city of Shechem? How innocent or how... Everyone has to put details into the story to figure out to do the right thing or the wrong thing. You don't kill innocent people. But you have to save Israel today is caught in the same dilemma. You have to defend yourself, you have to save your sister, and you have to take military action. But how do you balance the need to take military action and the need to respect human life and not punish someone who's not deserving of punishment?
Okay, however, though, both Bazak and Samet. I remember actually reading this. I don't remember the details anymore, but I've seen this back and forth in one of the books. They both, in order to arrive at their conclusion, and this is an interesting point here, they're analyzing the text, like you said, pshuto shel mikra, in a very high level. So my question to you is, so part of what I'm getting from what you're saying is that the text is, in a sense, open-ended towards our voices to come in and to, in a sense, engage in the in the in this
Tension.
tension. Yes, thank you. Tension that the text brings out. However, on the other hand,
Lo bashamayim either, Chazal
lo
say.
b'shamayim, nachon. However, that would seemingly imply to me, while you were saying that Bazak would have a certain position, Bazak has a certain position externally about this tension, and then he's reading it into the text, and then you would have Rav Samet has a certain position, and he's reading it, but that's not what they are doing.
No,
They're going
so I'll
through the
explain what I'm
text
getting at.
only. You
Yeah.
get my question?
Yeah, I got it. I'll
Okay.
tell you what I do with teacher training is that you have to differentiate between objective analysis and subjective interpretation. Students get mixed up all the time. The first step in anything is objective analysis. What's the text? Now, the books are begging subjective interpretation based on that objective analysis. Understand? But I can't suggest a subjective interpretation if I didn't do the analysis first. So you can argue maturely over the objective analysis, but that is objective. You should be able to reach a conclusion that everyone agrees on. Now, what's the meaning of that text? What's the interpretation? What message is behind the text that we argue on, and that's our tradition. But Parshim argued left and right. Did Avram do the right thing going down to Egypt? Remember, there's a time of famine. So there's one approach. The whole reason that we have to go down to Egypt as a nation and suffer for hundreds of years is because Avram didn't have Amunah. He should have stayed in Eretz Yisrael. He left the famine. You know what? Your kids have to suffer and go down to Egypt. That's a famous approach. Is that pshat? Maybe I can learn from the story that when there's a famine, you have to be logical, and you can't somech al nes. You can't depend on a miracle, and you should go down to Egypt. Should you lie about your wife? Shouldn't you lie about your wife? Is that the right thing or the wrong thing? But what I learned from Avram Avinu, I'm not sure, but we discussed that issue. But that story sparks a discussion. But the overriding message is, what's the right thing to do? I think Chumash calls it Lasot Yashar B'nei Hashem. You want to do what's right in God's eyes, but what's right in God's eyes? So there's a beautiful Ramban. I think it's like the most important Ramban to ever learn in Devarim chapter 6. That's where right after the Shema, in verses 16 and 17 and 18, he says, Shmor tishmor and all the mitzvot of Hashem. And then first keep all these laws, and then Vasita Yashar B'nei Hashem. So is that Yashar B'nei Hashem is equal to the mitzvot or in addition? There's an equal sign or a plus sign between them. And Ramban says beautifully, there's no way you can write a book to explain to you what to do 24/7. Chumash can write, but what can Chumash give you? And give you, I call dots on a graph. It can give you basic ideas, and I have to extrapolate. The goal of studying Chumash is not keeping the laws, studying the laws, and applying them to new situations. And always asking yourself, what would God want me to do in any situation? And I build that hashkafa, I build my understanding based on studying the stories and their deeper meaning. But I'm in search of doing what would God want me to do. But to make it alive and applicable in every generation, I'm always searching as a servant of God, what would God want me to do in any situation? And the mega themes in Chumash of your nation chosen to serve God, your nation that represents God by how it behaves. You're a model nation. You don't tell other people what to do. You act in a way that other people can learn from. And you have to strive your best to do what's right in the eyes of God. That requires study and self-introspection and healthy argument. And you achieve that through arguing maturely with each other. And there can be 12 tribes. There doesn't be only one path. There are many paths.
Right.
The umbrella that keeps everyone together is we're God's people, and we have to try our best to sanctify God in the way we run our lives.
Beautiful.
Very good. Yeah, I was just gonna ask about, there are obviously critiques of the method. What are some common critiques that you get that you find to be a challenge, perhaps, or even you find to be just silly, but people just persist with these questions?
Okay, so here's the problem. If Chumash is a book to study, not just read, I'll give you an example how I prove that to my students. When you study creation, so beautiful story, day 1, day 2, day 3, and there's a pattern to it. Like in the Gush method, you study the structure of the story. So every story begins with Vayomer Elokim, with a command, followed by an execution, followed by evaluation. Remember, Hu Amar V'yehi, Hu Tzilva V'yamod. It's God's commanding, God's doing, and God evaluates, day by day. And then you take a look. So what is it that God makes every day? So day 1, he makes light. Remember, day 2, the Shamayim up there, and separates the water. Now, it's a story of creation. But when you study it, what do you notice? The day 1 is parallel to day 4. I'm sure you're aware of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Day 1 is Or, day 3, the Ma'orot. And when did God make day and night? That proves the story. You can't take it literally. Day 2, God fates between heaven, the waters above and the waters below. Day 5 is going to be the fish in the sea and the birds up in the sky. And day 3, God makes land, and day 6, he makes land animals. You can't miss the parallel. But Chumash doesn't say, look at the parallel. But there's no doubt there's a parallel there. The fact that there's a parallel, we asked about literary structure, the fact that there's a parallel and there's a match, that's begging interpretation. Now, how do you interpret it? We argue about that. We try our best to understand what could be the meaning. And it's through that argument, we try to understand the meaning of the. So what's really interesting in creation is that on day 3, instead of 1 act of creation, there's 2 acts of creation. That's why there's 2 evaluations. Everyone knows Pamayim Kito, but that's because first God makes land and sees that's good, and then he makes light. He starts with vegetation, what's called Borei Preis and Borei Pi Adama. But there's 2 stages of creation that related to each other, but they're 2 separate acts. On day 6, he makes animals, evaluates, and then he has another act of creation, making man. So that jump from land to life, there's a quantum leap in creation. There's a similar jump from animal to man. But why is God setting that up? What can I learn from the fact that day 3 and day 6 have 2 acts of creation instead of 1? And so on day 3, there's a big jump from land to vegetation. Whoa, it's a quantum leap in development. And is there a similar leap between God making animals and man? One of the key points, I think, of Tzelem Elokim is that man's different than animal, even though he's similar to animal. So, what do you do with the fact that you're part of the animal kingdom? You're part of nature. You have animal instincts. Are we a super duper ape, or we have Tzelem Elokim? Are we is there something godly about us? Why did God give us our ability to be creative? And what does it mean to be the image of God? We can also think and do things and evaluate and do them. So this week we read Parsha Pekude. So what happened in Truma Tseva? God commands, Vasita, Vasita, Vasita. And what do? We do. Now we become partners with God in creation. Now, instead of God commanding and God doing, God commands, and we're his people, now we do it.
So part of that actually is, Bensi was just bringing up before that we engage with the text with this methodology, obviously very much so, that we find these chiastic structures and these literary motifs and parallelisms, everything. And naturally we come across our own ḥiddushim. That's what just happens. We have aha moments.
That's right.
The difficulty the challenges that you'll get maybe from certain pockets of the religious world will be like, well, who are you to come up with
subjective analysis? Who has license? Everyone has the obligation to do objective analysis. Who has the license to suggest subjective interpretation?
And to follow
question?
And just to follow with that, by showing that there's a literary structure running throughout the Torah, now it brings up the question of historicity from the perspective of if everything here is, if we're finding parallels and chiasms, so we're getting a literary structure, so then what does it inform us about what actually happens?
Right. So that, in my opinion, it doesn't make a difference. Right. I sometimes get in trouble for that. But God, I'll tell you how we say it in yeshiva, is that, are you studying mashakatuv or mashakara? It's the big argument among our teachers. Yoni Grossman, he's the big fan of you study mashkatuv lo mashakara, meaning here's what's written, and I get the message from what's written. Now, some people do the opposite, not the opposite, but they're on a treasure hunt or like a mystery thing, and I have to figure out what happened, reading between the lines. This must have happened. So first I study the text, I start comparing, here and that, and I have to make assumptions. This must have happened. This must have happened, and then I sort of try to deduce what actually happened, and I learn from what happened. Or do I learn from what's written? You understand the difference? Do I study mashkatuv or mashakara? Do I learn the lesson from what's written, or do I learn the lesson from what happened? It's a total. If you follow this Rabbi Medan Shiurim, he's always in search of what happened. He's ingenious of his ability to deduce events and figure out things happen. He's like doing like Sherlock Holmes on things. But sometimes, that's where Rabbi Leibtag always disagrees with him. He says, but if you follow the argument, he'll say, Rabbi Leibtag will say, oh, it's very beautiful. It's a nice board, but now it's what the role of midrash is wonderful, because what's midrash do? People misunderstand midrash. In ancient times, no one wrote books or op-eds or had podcasts, but people had opinions. So if you're living in the time of Tanaim, how do you express your opinion about life, about your insights? How do you share your Weltanschauung, your hashkafa? So there was a genre called midrash. You always opened up with a verse or some insight on. I'll give you an example because it's 2 weeks before Pesach. Let's say you want to give a lesson in differential education of what's called Chanoch L'Na'ar Lefi Darko. So I can say, there's different ways of teaching children. Give a whole, whole thing about how to teach advanced kids, challenge kids, the whole thing. What's the midrash do? They notice there's 4 times in Chumash where a parent answers a child, 3 times preceded by a question, and 1 time even without a question. But there's 4 times where a parent answers the child. Now, they use that realization and associate those 4 times with 4 different types of children. Now, Chumash isn't teaching you there's 4 different types of children. That's life. Then there's the kids the goody kids. There's kids with the attitude. There's the kids that aren't motivated. The kids who don't have the ability. There's all different types of kids. And what the Mishnah is teaching you is that, like, when you tell the Seder, don't answer the question, answer the child. So what's the Medrash beautifully do? It takes the questions from Chumash and associates each question with a different type of child. So, like the Chacham's question, like in Chumash, it's why is God giving all the laws? In Haggadah it turns, what are the laws? And we said, open up Masechet Pesachim. Learn Mechot Pesach. If a kid's asking what are laws, he's motivated already. He wants to learn more, so teach him laws. If a kid has an attitude problem, so we take, what's this to you? Now, in Chumash, those actual questions, that's not the topic of the questions. The topics are totally different. But I'm sort of stealing the questions and using what the Midrash does. Isn't coming to explain Chumash. It's using Chumash as a springboard to give over a lesson. That's beautiful. And that's what the rabbis do. But I can't turn that, that's why Chumash was written that way. No, Chumash didn't have the 4 sons, these 4 questions answers to teach you that there's 4 different types of children. I can figure that on my own. But the Midrash is using the fact that there's 4 different types of questions and answers between parents and children, and using that as a springboard to give over a lesson about differential education of Chanoch L'Na'ar Lefi Darko. But that's classic Midrash. But to appreciate the Midrash, you have to understand what they're doing. Right. But you can't mix that up with that's why it's called Midrash and not Pshat.
Beautiful. And I actually, sorry, I interrupted Benji's question, so I think it got skipped over. I wanted just to go back to that. Benji's question regarding the fact that there's so many new interpretations that are coming out in from Gush, and critics might say, what right do we have to essentially come up with things that our greatest Chazal, Rishonim, Achronim have not, how do we just come here and just open up all these
Yeah.
can of
So
worms.
what they always love to quote is the famous Rashbam in the beginning of Parshat Todot, where Rashbam was a young, student finding things about what's Elu Todot mean, and he respectfully argues with his grandfather with Rashi. I'm sure you're familiar.
And Rashi says the apshatim
I'm sure the
amikachim
Mikachot
b'chol yom.
Koyo. Yeah,
I never understand why people never why is that
yeah.
glossed over? Like, come on.
Why? Because it's super dangerous because you get what's called in English narishkeit.
True.
The second you open up interpretation to the public, you get and you need quality control. Now, in my opinion, who decides? No, if Ramban was told you can't argue with Rashi, we wouldn't have Ramban. No, if Ramban grew up in our called Yeshiva world, right, where Rashi's Ruach HaKodesh, and that's absolute truth, and how can you dare question Rashi? A, we never have Ramban, right? But Ramban is awesome. So Ramban, he always opens, Pirush HaKuntros, he quotes Rashi and respectfully disagrees. And I think Rashi would want him to disagree. That's what's called the Beit Midrash. We argue over what's the deeper meaning of the text. That's what Parshanim do. Right? That's what I try to teach my students. If you want to appreciate Parshanim, the commentators all did objective analysis, and in light of that, they share with you their subjective interpretation. But if you didn't but they don't share with you the objective analysis, they assume you did that. See what people get stuck with? No, when a Ramban writes something, he's assuming you know the sugya. Same thing in the Talmud also. Now, if you know the sugya and you study it and you were bothered by the same problems, you appreciate their commentary and you can learn from them tremendously. If you just read the commentary without doing the footwork beforehand, you can misunderstand the commentary. When that's something to really appreciate. The most important part about what you call the Gush Tanakh, the objective analysis, is simply to appreciate the Parshanim. It's to be able to understand Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, all the class, to understand properly, you have to play the same game they did. And it's always to prove they did that objective analysis. But they don't share that with you. They only share with you their interpretation.
Did they see a literary structure though?
You can that's what we talk about all the time. They don't walk it through it, but you can see from their interpretation they're onto something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You say that. Now
you can also see from Chazal. There's definitely intertextuality going on with Midrash.
Oh, first, that's because I'll give you an example. What's the right methodology? So Rabbi Shmuel has 13 principles of how to do subjective interpretation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you can argue what are the principles of interpretation. Rabbi Akiva was Dorish every oath Shabbat Torah. Rabbi Shmuel was different. You have different approaches, and they're all legitimate, but they all share the goal of, what message is God trying to give to us? I'm maybe a bit more postmodern. I'm claiming that God wants us to argue. The media is the message. That's lo b'shamayim. But if you're striving to do the right thing, and it's through the argument and striving and trying to understand, that's how you grow.
To be fair, this idea that you bring out that Hashem wants us to, the tension brings out the discussion with which we then, argue or have a dialogue, better word, right? I think that, first of all, Rabbi Sachs, alav shalom, always spoke about this, how you'll see like Avraham, even in the Tanakh itself, Hashem wants the Nevi'im to be arguing with God.
One could argue that's what prayer means. You understand my joke? And that joke, my hand. That's what litpalel is to argue. Klilim, you go to a court. Now, you're not arguing, oh, I'm right, God, you're wrong. You're arguing your case. Listen to Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay? He's trying to explain, God, it's in your interest, you're more forgiving. Remember when Moshe prays and says, God, don't break the covenant, bring the covenant back, but you can't be so strict. Next time you need to be forgiving. We want to be your people. So it's like a great example of objective analysis and interpretation. When you read the flood story, okay, you can't miss the connection between the flood story and Mount Sinai. Are you aware of that?
There's so many thematic links.
40 days, 40 nights. Matzah Ben Hashem, just Moshe and Aaron. Let me kill everyone else, make you the only one. The covenant afterwards. There's just so many parallels.
Even the entrance of Moshe's character coming through the ark, a little mini arc, right?
Teva is only those two stories. That's it. Chumash is screaming. I call wake up and smell the Chumash. It's begging interpretation. Now, what's the meaning of it? Go argue. There's something deep going on. It's about a road of tikkun, about fixing. I claim the Kabbalists are the earliest Bible critics. I mean, their whole point is don't take it literally, take it seriously. There's something really deep going on in Chumash, and they're giving you deep life lessons. I'm talking about like real, not the phony Kabbalists, the real Kabbalists, like the Ramban type of Kabbalah.
Okay.
Remember Ramban when he says, "Oh, what do you think? We care about digging wells." Remember when Yitzchak digs wells, but that represents finding God. Knows God's hidden. Have to find Him. You have to dig. You have to, that idea of Hester. That you can't see God. You can perceive God, but if you don't look for Him, you won't find Him. There's so many deep ideas there, and they're onto something really big. But if you just, if you misunderstand it, you can go in the wrong direction. That's why this approach is dangerous because it can be misunderstood.
And it is. It's always misunderstood.
It's always misunderstood. And then it doesn't mean anything goes. And the fact that you can say anything you want, you need quality control, but you need, that's why you need humility and respect. Now, but I like to claim my taina, what's the taina? Complaint about academia. To write a paper, master's or PhD, you have to come up with a topic that no one ever heard before. You have to come up with your own chiddush, right? When you're searching for a chiddush, you end up with nourishment. You end up with that. Don't search for a chiddush because you're blinded. Briskers who don't understand the brisker approach make the same mistake. I have to find a chakira. You don't look for a chakira. A chakira is, you know what that is. There's no word for translate it. Right? It's got to find you. Then you study. You study for understanding. In your search for understanding, a light bulb will go off. It says just realize something. The chiddush has to find you, not you looking for a chiddush. So in academia, I have to come up with something new. So you got to come up with something, and it's usually your goal is to find something new that no one ever said before, and your goal isn't to understand the text. In real Judaism, in real study, in art study, is your goal is to understand the text, to understand Devar Hashem, and in your search of what's Devar Hashem, you might uncover something that someone else didn't notice before, and then you share it with your friend. Now, 99% of the time, what you're saying is ridiculous. And you have to recognize that. And therefore, you test it with your friends and you discuss it. And that's what the Beit Midrash is about. But you have an idea, hey, that makes sense. Oh, that's good. And then it started catching on. That's our tradition. But what made Rashi great? Because Rashi's great. And everyone accepted Rashi. And
I find that to be so beautiful, by the way. I can just envision the Beit Midrash where people are learning Chumash and they're learning it critically with trying to arrive at an understanding of the text. And then I could see a student having an idea and he bounces it off, his chavruta or his rebbe or whoever he feels like doing it. And this conversation ensues about this idea. I can't find a better way to get people so excited to learn Torah. Like for me, I think that's just I feel like, especially like I went through the yeshiva system to a certain extent, not fully, but it's a little bit of a stifling atmosphere because you're sort of you can't really ever really grow within your own mind. You're kind of having to just conform to ideas all the time. Now, of course, that doesn't mean to just take chas v'chalila, just do whatever you want, say whatever you want, think whatever you want. Obviously, we're not talking like that, right? But like in this type of serious atmosphere, right? Where, and especially with Chumash, because it's just, people don't even learn Chumash much these days. It's like, to sit there with the
Torah.
Really, like it really bothers me when I hear that. Okay. But to sit there and to really like open your mind while learning Chumash, but while engaging with it very seriously and trying to understand it for what it is, and then having these ideas pop into your mind, and then bouncing it off with, I just think that that's a very healthy, exciting, vibrant atmosphere. That's why I have a
It's
four-year-old
called Torah
son.
Chaim.
Torah
Torah
Chaim.
Chaim.
I have a four-year-old son. I say this all the time. Probably the fifth time I said this on the pod. I'm speaking it into existence. My dream is for my four-year-old son to come to Har Etzion after high school. Without Hashem, that's my dream. But I really think that it fosters a love of Torah, a love of, not just a love of Torah. I mean, a love of engaging with the Torah. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess David Foreman has a great report. We schmooze all the time. So he's amazing. I'm sure you've
We've had him
you
on.
interviewed him.
Huge fan.
Yeah. So David says this new approach, right? We've been doing it for years. It's called a Dvar Torah, right? Everyone who gives their Torah says something no one ever said before, but usually it's not serious. You follow? So the accepted approach is saying things that are just cute, but like no one had. Saying something good, oh, that's forbidden. No, there's nothing wrong with saying something, say it, but hey, saying, hey, that makes sense. Whoa.
That's the
So
most
that's what he calls
threatening
the new
thing, is that the more correct, or the more it makes, or the more that it's actually compelling, it's scary to that person. It's threatening to that person who feels like, wait, like, so now I have to rethink my entire understanding of how I've had Chazal pictured in my head. Do you get what I'm saying? It's
yeah. So
it's a really
that's
weird
a
thing.
chance in education. Now, on the flip side, I'm a big fan of people who don't like this approach, and they're probably right, because part of being Jewish is not changing anything. You know what I'm saying? And we do what our parents did, and you need 99% of people doing that. No, but you always need 5% pushing the envelope.
Okay. Well,
You know what I'm saying? But you need that that pushback. Now, I'll share with you something a little more modern. There's another reason for the modern approach. It has to do with returning to Israel for two reasons. One is you're living in the land of Israel, everything becomes alive. You see the places. The way you look at Chumash when you live in Israel, and that's already something amazing. Just the land thing that Rabbi Ben, that's what I learned from him the most. You see the places, you understand. You stand in Mispeh Yericho and look at the Jordan River Valley, and you read Sefer Yeshua and the story of the spies. With Rachav and everything, and you just see the story in front of you. You see Arvot Moab. You can picture Moshe. You can just picture everything, the hard for the whole thing. But you understand much better when you're there. Yeah. But more than that, for 2,000 years we're in exile. We don't have sovereignty. We don't have a state. So we don't have the idea of being a nation in the service of God. We're individuals, a community serving God. The idea of a nation serving God. How do you serve God in a nation? How do you have an army that represents God, that acts in a way that's how do you run a government? So we don't have a Masorah on that. But all these topics that's half of Chumash, like all the laws of Dvarim of running a nation, and now they become realistic, and how to apply them. So that's one side of it. The other side is thematic study of Tanakh was a big boost for Christianity. Why? Because when you study Tanakh thematically, you can't miss the importance of nationhood and the land of Israel. Now, one of their proofs that God left you, in case you realize that there's they start with they hold by the Old Testament, but God, our covenant with God was broken, and God has a new covenant. That's why it's called the New Testament. We, of course, disagree with them. We hold that God didn't fire us. He just, we went through rehab.
When he says
but
it's eternal,
the proof that it's gone, was the fact that we have to return to our land, and that's why the church and it was so much against the state of Israel, being formed again. It goes against their whole ideology. But now that we're back, hey, we're back in our land again. The danger of thematic Bible study is in many ways it supports it. It's so clear the importance of nationhood in the land of Israel that if it's gone for 2,000 years, wake up, God left you. Now that we're back, now that we're back, I can go back to that thematic approach because now it's supporting our understanding of Judaism.
Right.
Because the Christians use that approach to prove to you that you're not chosen, that they're right. But now that whole argument of this is gone. So returning to our land for many reasons, opens up a whole new way of looking at Chumash, which was kept by the wet, was kept under the radar because it supported Christianity too much. It's not supporting Christianity's right, but a main contention of Christianity is that God left you because you haven't returned to your land. But now that we're back in our land, so the danger of that thematic study is not as like it used to be, and the meaning of that study and its application in day-to-day life is super important. So that's why it comes to life, because it's halacha l'maisa now.
I think another thing to add to that, I think there's a few things that the modern reader and learner of Torah is exposed to is artifactual evidence, which the Rishonim and all of them maybe did not have, obviously didn't have the things that we have. And also our answers to questions have to be a lot more refined today because the challenges are much greater. We're dealing with biblical criticism that's forcing us to be even more meticulous in a way that they're posing questions that weren't posed before. So now we have to answer questions that weren't answered before. So it must be our generation that is engaging.
It's got to be more sophisticated. It's not apologetics. The Bible critics, they do the same objective analysis, but their conclusion is multiple authorship. You follow? So in the Gush you find different what's called bechinot. That's Rabbi Breuer's whole beauty of his approach. But God does that on purpose to teach you. There's a very complex understanding of life and our relationship with God. It's like Shir Hashirim. Our relationship with God is complex, and with it's how to relate to God. Life's complex. There's all its complexities. To appreciate the complexity of our relationship with God, God uses multiple names to help teach us how to do it. It's called the Rav Soloveitchik's Adam 1 and Adam 2. Because if you have complex molecules or complex, physical things, you need complex equations to describe them. So the complexity of the Bible, when you understand Chumash is being written not to tell you what happened, but to understand your relationship with God. So the different names of God all are part of the Chumash's approach or method of teaching you how to deal with that complexity and how to, so that's very deep in the approach. But the danger of that approach is, you might think that their conclusions are right. So you begin with emunah that God is allowed to use multiple names to give over his message. Now the question is, what do you learn from the fact that God makes two britot with Avram Avinu, one with God's name Yud Kei Vav Kei, and one with God's name Elokim? It doesn't mean there's two gods. It means that's why we scream Hashem Hu Elokim. Say it 7 times.
I actually happen to think that the literary structure, as much as it garners questions and criticisms, as we spoke about before, one thing I think that it actually clearly takes away is the question of multiple authorship. It is very difficult to say that there's multiple authors, yet a cohesive message, literary structure that's running throughout all of it's very, very difficult. So for all the criticisms that come about it, I actually think it solves one of the chief issues that have been raised in the last 200 years, besides the fact that Kasuto himself, I think he mentions, I don't know this from a historical perspective, but I trust Kasuto when he says that there's not one ancient Near East document ever found to have multiple authors. So
it's a theory, which is
now we found one. Okay.
Yeah, but
it's not serious in my opinion.
I'm saying the theories are they don't hold water when you study in depth. Now, if your assumption is it's an historical text, right? So you can't miss the contradictions. But if the contradictions are intentional to teach you complexity, and don't take it literally, take it seriously. So it's through the what's called this throat that I learned from them. That's one of the days that Torah Nidreshim him. But it's a much more mature approach, much more complex approach to it. But but Breuer always used to call them, the Bible critics call them plumbers. No, they do the dirty, they do the dirty work. They open that, but his conclusions are totally different.
Oh gosh. I wanted to know if you have time just to give for the audience a little bit of a taste of your style and your insight. I came across your essay in the Torah Etzion book on who sold Yosef to Mitzrayim. It's spectacular. And I wanted to know if you can give a few minutes so that the audience can get a little bit of a taste for uh your approach and the way you go about certain things within the text. So I wanted to know if you can give a little bit of a outline and presentation for your essay of who sold the brother, who sold Yosef.
Almost everything, but everything I've come up with um, was never in search of a chiddush, but rather in the middle of teaching, I teach a lot. So when people ask me what's the best way to learn a book, I say find somebody to teach it to. You learn something by teaching it, because when you teach it, you have to understand it. When you have to explain to somebody else. That's why I did Charuta learning also. Teach something. That's the way to learn something. I always say to teachers, for an assignment, don't give them a test. Tell them, take what you learned, teach it to a parent, teach it to a to a peer or something, and then share what happened when you taught it. But when you have to teach it to somebody else, then that helps to clarify it. I always say that the class has to happen in the student's head. But the idea in the class study, but in the middle of teaching something, a light bulb goes off. Oh my gosh, I just noticed something. When you teach something, that's when you begin to notice things because your mind is engaged.
Yes.
Because when you have to explain to somebody else, it's got to make sense. And I think that I think it makes sense to say the assumption that Chumash is supposed to make sense. But again, begin what's your assumption? What's the purpose of the book? But when you study the story, the technicalities of who sold Yosef, just look at there's a bit of realism in the story, and the text is there for those. When you read it carefully, you'll find it. Now, there is an example where if you don't know the topography or geography of Israel, you wouldn't begin to understand, the whole, Vaised, lift up his eyes and they see. When you're on a tiyul and you see the view and you can see, Transjordan from the top of the hill, and you can see cars coming down the hill from, Tenkab. You can't see a person, but you can see a caravan. And then how long it takes to go there, and the desert and there's pits. Some in the winter there's water in them, in the summer there's no water. And if you want to hide a body, I want a place where people aren't going to be there. But there's a trade. It just you put realism into the story. But I didn't look. I wasn't looking for a new way to read it. In the middle of teaching it, it just dawned on me. Oh, that makes sense. And that's what I'm saying. If you want to, don't look for a chiddush. Just study something and teach it, and discuss and argue about it, and that's how you find things. But and sometimes you do things and you realize what I said. That's you argue with yourself a lot of times. Now, what you pray for, and I think on Shabbos, is that you want to serve Hashem. What's called v'ter libenu l'avcha bemet. So the danger in Bible study, I plead guilty sometimes, is that you take your hashkafa and you read it into it.
Yeah,
and that happens too often. In other words, you take the Bible, you're not looking for I have my political opinion, and I read it into. I can find my in any story. I can find my political opinion, right wing or left wing. So I'll tell you something I'd like to teach this. Ramban talks about when it says in Parshat Todot, remember that pasuk? I always say the psukim in Rishon in the first Aliyah people know, thanks to Monday and Thursday, thanks to laning. So like the amount of commentary on the first Aliyah is 10 times more than commentary on the rest of the parsha. And there's some sections I call Shvi syndrome, where by the time you get to the end of the parsha, no one knows it, and there's no commentaries either because you run out of steam by then. But so Ramban, it's the first Aliyah. So he's bothered by it says Avram Vaishmor Mishmarti Mitzvotaichu Kutai V'Toratai. Remember, Avram kept all these things. So the Parshim want to know what's each thing referring to. So that's the famous Rashi where the Abbot kept the entire Torah. Torah Shebiktav, Torah Shebapeh, the whole midrashic approach. Now, every other Parshan disagrees, and I don't think Rashi meant it literally either. But that's a different discussion. Now the Ramban says, what was Vaishmor Mishmarti? How do you watch God's guard? So Ramban says, what did Avram do? He looks in Avram's life. Where did Avram watch God's guard? So what did Avram do? He explained the belief in God and argued with idol worshippers. He was actually defended God publicly. He stood up for God. He explained the existence of God, and he argued with idol worshippers to bring people to follow God. But he argued with idol worshippers to put them in the right direction, and that was part of Avram's greatness. Now, what would an academic person say? What's Ramban? You tell me, what's Ramban doing when he's reading the text? Why would Ramban see Avram Avinu? Why would we interpret by Shmar Mishparti, watching God's guard, by arguing with idol worshippers and standing up for God?
I mean, because he projected his own views, his own experiences, maybe on the text.
Yeah, and what famous experience is that?
So the disputation of Barcelona.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So what you would say in academia is, what's Ramban doing? He's looking for, he's reading the text, looking for his own,
he's reading himself
the text based on his life. Now, but if you know the history behind it, Ramban's commentary on Chumash was, the disputation was towards the end of his life. Remember, he got a free one-way ticket to Israel afterwards, and there's 6, 7 different changes he made when he got to Israel, including Ramban reinterpreted Chumash when he found the coin, and reinterpreted what's harchek, what do you call it? Where Kevaracha is, because he believed his tour guide. What's how far was it away? How far is Kever Rachel from Lod Kivrat Aretz to Efrata? Remember? So is Kivrat Aretz a short distance or a long distance? And that depends where you put Kever Rachel. Anyway, that's a whole different topic of where Kever. We know where Kever Rachel is. Where she's actually buried is a different story. But that's a famous argument among commentators. But we know there's 6 or 7 commentaries that he changed afterwards, and he wrote them afterwards. But his main commentary of Chumash was written before the disputation. So I like to tell my students, Ramban isn't reading his life into Torah. Ramban wrote his commentary on Chumash way before then. Right? Ramban is living his life based on his commentary. You understand the difference? Yeah. It's not that Ramban read into Avram's story because of his life experience. Avram lived his life based on his Torah study. Ramban interpreted Torah, and he was inspired by his interpretation, and that's why he stood up to the plate and was willing. He saw that's what Avram did. When Avram was Korei B'Shem Hashem, he stood up for his values, and he argued with other people, and that was his greatness. And in light of that understanding, Ramban was willing to take that challenge and defend Judaism in front of the church.
He saw it as a call to action.
Yeah, as a call. Yeah, and I think and when you see the historicity behind his pirush, that's proper Torah study. You understand that it's not. I have my opinion, and let me find my opinion in Chumash. It's striving to study Chumash. What's the right thing to do, and living your life based on your what's called a search, or to try and search your best ability to understand what God wants, but not to taint it with my opinion, which isn't so easy to do.
Of course not. Yeah.
But some people do it way too often. That's what we call them parsha sheets on they give out in shul every Friday. So everybody's got their political approaches, and then let's prove my hashkafa from this story and that story, and therefore right wing, whatever you're going to do, but that becomes that's even more dangerous. But I try to keep politics out of things.
For sure.
Beautiful.
Love it. So we really wanted to thank you once again. This was really amazing, eye-opening. We urge everybody to read all of the books put out by the Gush Yeshiva, Magid's.
And I encourage people to argue with them also.
Argue with them also.
And we love when people argue. That's the most important thing.
Of course.
And we have to argue with ourselves also, but you're in search of, the goal isn't to come up with the Chiddush. The goal is to understand Dvar Hashem. And again, as time changes and history changes, and we have the challenge of starting a nation, and everything becomes alive. But to do it with truth and search, that's the most important thing to do. And people who disagree with the approach, 100%, it's a legitimate approach not to agree with the approach, because it's dangerous. It's dangerous across the street also. It's dangerous.
It's an approach that has to be taken with Yirat Shamayim and seriousness.
Yeah.
And honestly, anyone who really takes the time to read the material in Gush, see that the this is why we want to also bring we're trying to bring Gush people onto the podcast so that they could see that the people that are bringing all these incredible ḥiddushim have yirat shamayim and are very serious. And this is not, it's not like, that's part of the reason why we want to have you on and groom it. By the way, if you can put in a good word for us, and I would love to have Rabbi Bazak. I don't know how his English is, but that would be like, but no, but seriously, the whole team at Gush, that whole faculty, it's incredible. We're pushing it because we believe in it, and it's inspired us, and we wanted to inspire others. And I know how much time and effort and passion and love that you put into every single idea that's put out in those books, and we appreciate everything.
I'll share with you an idea in closing. Somebody reminded me that I'm in Hollywood for Shabbat. I was a scholar in residence this weekend, and one of my ex-students reminded me of something I said years ago on a tiul or on a Shabbaton, whatever it was. We were, we were in Shabbaton somewhere, and we were near a site, and there was a building site next door, and there was a sign in Hebrew under construction. It says "Sakana kan bonim." What that means in Hebrew? Danger. Here we're building. It's basically like every construction site. There's it says construction site, like keep away or be careful. So by chance, it was time for, I saw that sign, and I gave him a sikha about the land of Israel. It's dangerous in Israel. Why? But why is it dangerous? There's sakana starting a state. Why? Because you're building something. You can't build something without there's dangers. So one approach is don't build anything. If you're worried about a building site, so I can say, okay, let's not build, or I can build, but wear a hard hat, like protect yourself. But if you're going to build something, there's dangers. Being aware of the dangers, that you can't be careless when you're building. You have to take safety precautions, but you have to build. And when you build, there's inherent dangers. You have to be careful of them. But it's dangerous in Israel because you're building a state. But doesn't mean not to build. You have to build. Same thing when you have an approach and you're studying Torah, there's dangers in an approach. But that's not a reason not to build, but do it carefully. And be aware of the danger, but that's not a reason. The fact that it's a dangerous zone doesn't mean not to do it. But that also means not everyone should be on the construction site. And therefore, if it's a totally legitimate approach, it doesn't it brings it. Sometimes the danger's that way. It's what's called risk management. Same thing when you send a kid to yeshiva. Where do you send them? A place that's going to inspire them, a place that's going to look. It depends on the child. And Baruch Hashem, there's lots of different gap year programs, and you have to pick the one that the student needs, that fits his religious needs. But with that idea, you guys are building something also. Using the internet for good reasons. People listening, but hearing different opinions and hearing alternative approaches. That's how we grow, but we have to do it respectfully.
Absolutely.
That's and one last line is there's always good reasons for sinat chinam. And got it. There's always reasons for baseless hatred, and that's sometimes our biggest national problem. There shouldn't. That's exactly that's what sinat chinam is. And be aware of that all the time. That's the real message of the Yosef story. But that's all. We have to be careful. We have to see each other as partners and argue respectfully, and try to understand the other side, but also be dedicated to our side. And together, that's how we build a nation. Okay, good. Anyway, thank you so much.
This was so important to do.
This was great.
This was so important to do. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
And we have to thank Yaakov Beasley. It was his idea that I should.
Yes. Okay.
Wonderful.
So now that we're on the topic, let's thank Rabbi Yaakov Beasley. He went out of his way, emailed us, tried to get you on the podcast, and he was amazing on the podcast as well. And we're very thankful and grateful that the network we've created, also just being even connected to these great rabbis, is just such a
really, it's an honor.
It's a real honor. So thank you so much.
Okay. Have a good week. Okay, bye-bye.